It's been a while, hasn't it? 2024 was a really, really busy year. I did probably double the amount of hours I did in 2023 and then some. There was always something going on. Back in June 2024, I had a long weekend in York. I was in fact there for a family history fair, but it meant I had a chance to visit Warmgate, one of the streets in the city centre, where some of my ancestors just happened to have lived. I also found two churches that featured in their lives and sort of tried to get an idea of some of the places where they worked and the kind of things they might have known. Now, I don't know too much about my 4 times great-granddad, John Dunning. I think he was born somewhere between 1780 and 1784. Records vary. Possibly he came from Wigington, which is just outside York, but I'm not certain. I do know that he died in the city of York in 1838. Which means census records are not going to solve his story. Even so, I have got a rough idea of some of the things that went on in John's life, and today I'm going to tell you how I managed to piece the story together. I found an extract in the York Herald which suggests to me that if this extract is talking about my John Dunning, he might have been a bit of a daredevil in his youth. He's somewhere between 19 and 23 in May 1803 when this report is printed. A request. Pardon asked. I, John Dunning of Wigington in the North Riding of the County of York, did on Friday the 29th of the previous month shoot at and maim a buck, so a deer, belonging to a Richard Darley, Esquire, he's a gentleman, of Aldeby Park, that sounds grand, which he hereby publicly begs pardon of the said Richard Darley, Esquire. John returns thanks for Darley's leniency in waiving any action or prosecution which he might have commenced against John. He acknowledges that this is going to be allowed at his own expense to be printed in the York Herald. It's then written John Dunning underneath, signed effectively, but there's an extra note to say his mark with an X across beside it, so John probably couldn't write. And just as the newspapers said, Aldeby Park was owned by the Darley family. It had been with them since the 1550s, but it was remodelled as a Georgian mansion in the 1720s, so would have been relatively new when John Dunning was associated with it. These days, if you wish, you can visit Aldeby Park. You can even get married there. Talking of weddings, Aldeby Park is 8 miles to the northwest of York. It's not very far from Gate Helmsley, where in the late 18th century and early 19th century a widow lived by the name of Jane Newton. She is very relevant to this story because she is my 5 times great-grandmother, and in 1803 at least 3 of the children were still alive. Mary was 45, Jane was 39, and Hannah was 23. A few months earlier, Mary Newton had married in York at St Dennis and St George's Church to an innkeeper by the name of Matthew Horsley. As things turned out, they wouldn't be married for particularly long time. 7.5 years later, in 1810, the registers of St Dennis's Church tell us that Matthew Horsley, innkeeper, died on April the 10th, was buried the 13th, 48 years, fever. So we know what he died from. So what was his widow Mary to do now? Well, the practical thing, of course. He was an innkeeper, she took over the inn and announced it to the world in the newspapers. Malt Shovel Inn, Warmgate. Mary Horsley, widow of the late Mr. Matthew Horsley, begs leave to return her most sincere thanks for the favours conferred on her late husband. In other words, she appreciated his customers, and takes this opportunity of informing them that she intends continuing the business of the said inn. Mary is going nowhere, she is staying at the Malt Shovel, and hopes by strict attention to merit the future favours and support of her friends. In other words, the husband's died, Mary's taken over, she's hoping people will continue to support her business and have faith in her that she knows what she's doing. As things would turn out, Mary's time as landlady was really quite brief. 20 months later, on the 5th of December 1811, Mary Horsley, widow of Matthew Horsley, innkeeper, died. That's fairly clear that it's the right woman. She was 53 years old, and the parish register says she died from inflammation of the stomach. 3 days later, she was buried, also at St Dennis's Church, just down the road from the Malt Shovel. As for what became of the Malt Shovel itself, this is where it gets interesting. This is where my ancestor Hannah comes in, Mary's little sister. Days after Mary dies, Hannah puts her own little note in the York Herald. What she says is quite revealing. She's been helping her sister Mary for several years. What she is saying is that she understands how to run an inn, and she is trained under her sister and brother-in-law, and with them dead, she's now asking their customers to trust her to prove that she can run their business as their legacy. Quite an achievement. The year 1811 begins. 31-year-old Hannah Newton, a single woman, has taken over her family's business. And here is where this John Dunning enters, or re-enters, the picture. I wonder when he first heard that the landlady at the Malt Shovel was a young, unmarried woman. I wonder whether he was one of her regular customers, or perhaps he deliberately started to frequent that particular inn because he fancied Hannah. Were they genuinely attracted to each other? Or did he have something more calculating in mind? If he was to marry this young single landlady, he could quickly become the fairly young married landlord. The real motivation, the real answer, is lost to history. All I do know is that on the 29th of February 1812, John Dunning of Easingwold, so he wasn't from York itself, he was from just outside York, and Hannah Newton of St Dennis's parish were married at St Dennis's Church on Warmgate. On their marriage licence, both parties claimed to be 28 years old. Now, personally, based on her baptism record and the fact that I've matched her up to a sister called Mary. I think Hannah was more likely to be around 32. I suspect that her new husband John could have been about the same age. There's quite some fluidity there, and that's why you should always take ages with a pinch of salt. That same year, the polling books for York include the name Dunning John Aledraper, Warmgate. Aledraper's quite an unusual word. It is defined by the University of York's Yorkshire Historical Dictionary. An aledraper is simply a seller of ale, an alehouse keeper. Apparently, the occupation was recorded in the parish registers for All Saints Church on Pavement in York as early as 1779. For all we know, it might have been recorded in other registers. That's simply the example that the website gives. But after this, after 1812, we can chart family life for the Dunnings using other parish registers. On the 29th of July 1813, John and Hannah have a son named John, baptised at St Denis in York. Unfortunately, baby John was buried a day later, and the fact that he was baptised so quickly suggests to me that they knew he wasn't going to make it. The 10th of September 1815, a couple of years later, Sarah, a daughter, is baptised at St Denis, followed by, in April 1818, another son called John. He's named after his father, he's named after his elder brother, again at St Denis's. And then finally, the last child, on the 17th of September 1821, a daughter named Mary, who was baptised not at St Denis's, but at St Margaret's on Warmgate. The two churches are relatively close together. And by this point in time, the parish registers have got a space for the father's occupation. John is recorded as an innkeeper. After September 1821, no further children are recorded as having been baptised to John and Hannah Dunning in York, which I think does make some sense considering that Hannah was 41 or thereabouts in 1821. I think it's quite unlikely that she would have had any more children. Being in 1821, although census records did exist at this time, in fact one was taken in 1821, they're generally of quite limited use to family historians, or considered to be. But even without the wealth of information on later census records, throughout the 1820s you can actually pinpoint some other important dates in John and Hannah Dunning's lives, just using the trade directories that are available for the city of York. In 1823, Baines's History Directory and Gazetteer of the County of York places victualler John Dunning at the Malt Shovel on Warmgate. They're still at the Malt Shovel. And of course, what I think this also implies is that his youngest daughter Mary, who's my ancestor, could well have been born at the pub in September of 1821. She was, after all, baptised on Warmgate too. 1828 to 29, Pigot's released their Directory of Yorkshire, which offers some evidence that the Dunnings were still at that very same address when Mary was around 7 years old. Under taverns and public houses, we've got the Old Malt Shovel on Warmgate, run by John Dunning. And at this time, of course, John's wife Hannah has probably been living at that pub for about 17 years. yet, looking further on into the newspapers, on the 18th of July 1829, the York Herald remarks that a Thomas Stevenson was in charge. So the Dunnings appear to have moved on. But where to? Just down the road. We have some evidence to support this further in the Yorkshire Gazette. The Five Lions Inn, Warmgate, York. John Dunning, grateful to his friends and the public for the liberal degree of patronage which he has received during his residence at the Old Malt Shop, so there's a connection between the two, this is one and the same person, respectfully informs them that he has taken and entered upon the Five Lions Inn, lately occupied by Mr. Taylor, 2 doors higher up the street. That was probably a day of carting boxes from one place to another. This is suggesting to me too that they had probably moved fairly recently. If the advert is dated the 6th of June, perhaps they moved as late as May of 1829. But it wasn't so long afterwards that the Five Lions Inn was the scene of a remarkable incident, apparently involving 14-year-old John Dunning Jr., John and Hannah's son. I'm going to guess that on this particular occasion maybe his parents were making him useful around the inn. Perhaps they had some kind of stabling and he was an ad hoc stable hand. Believe it or not, his name was reported in the Dublin Observer, so in an Irish newspaper. This teenager from York, a Scotch Galloway, was taken into the yard of Mr. Dunning of the Five Lions Inn on Warmgate on Thursday afternoon, which his son mounted. The animal set off at full speed toward the river. The yard terminates with a passage and several steps. The animal leaped down, the boy keeping his seat. They were both plunged to the bottom of the river. Quite dramatic. On rising to the surface, the animal swam to the opposite side, and the boy and Galloway were landed in safety without either having sustained any injury at all. What on earth were the people standing in the yard of the Five Lions thinking? A Scotch Galloway is incidentally an extinct breed. During the 18th and 19th century, the Galloway pony, which I'm guessing is what this horse was noted to have been capable of covering long distances at astonishing speeds. But what's really interesting is that the newspaper describes the yard at the Five Lions Inn as going all the way down to the River Foss. Well, according to an 1851 sheet map of York, yes it did. The maps are proving what the newspaper says, and you can't get much better than that. Of course, we remember now that John Dunning didn't live to see the 1841 census, so we can't use census records to learn anything about him. So we have to turn to other pre-1841 resources, such as Pigot's Directory, again the 1834 edition this time. The York section includes the Five Lions with other hotels, inns and taverns, perfectly logical, gives the address as 14 Warmgate, and it names the landlord as John Dunning. My ancestor Mary would have been about 13 and her brother John about 16. School was not compulsory in the 1830s. Even at that relatively young age, they may well have been assisting their parents at the pub. I think it would have been a completely normal situation. But Pigot also tells us something else about life at the Five Lions. Public houses were popular pick-up and drop-off points for coaches and carriers. I suppose the nearest modern equivalent would be something like a delivery van driver. And according to Pigott, every Saturday, 2 carriers left York city centre for Ellerton, which is a village about 6 miles to the south-east. One, Samuel Gawthorpe, set out from the White Horse on Coppergate, which I think is not far from the Jorvik centre, and the other, James Burton, began his trip from the Five Lions. There could well have been quite a lot of coming and going at the inn. As for John Dunning Sr., he died on the 10th of October 1838 at Walmgate, where he lived for the whole of his 26-year marriage. According to the death certificate, he was only 58 years old. His death was caused by a decline. In other words, his health gradually sank for no obvious specific reason. Maybe we could interpret it as something like tuberculosis. Maybe it's something that caused a kind of progressive weakness, maybe some type of anemia, a condition that would be obvious with modern medical testing that didn't quite make sense in 1830s York. They just knew that he was ill and getting worse. Although I did look around the churchyard at St Denis, I couldn't actually find a headstone for John or any of the other Dunnings, but it does really seem like the perfect resting place for him. He's just a few yards away from where his malt trouble was, and also his 5 lions. So all in all, we're never going to get a photograph of him. We're never going to find him on a census. But based on what I found out about John, I think it seems that you can in fact build up a picture of somebody's life without needing the census records at all.